Thank you, David, for the invitation to be here. It's always good to come back to my old stomping grounds at the Heritage Foundation. I have a couple of points I want to quickly go through, things that I've sort of learned in my 3 decades of being involved in these issues. Number one, tax base matters more than people think. When Mark was talking about consumed income tax, what does that mean? That's a tax-based issue. It's what's being taxed, not just the rate. And there is a fight between those who believe in a consumed income tax base, which means no double taxation of savings and investment, versus those who believe in what's called the Haig-Simons tax base. This gets into what Stanley Surrey would have believed in back when he was here in town. And it's all about how you treat capital. And it's one of the reasons why there was dissatisfaction by some on the right with the 86 Tax Reform Act, because, yes, it did dramatically lower tax rates, but it also increased the double taxation of saving and investing. And that caused a lot of angst among people. And sometimes you get bipartisan pieces of legislation, such as Nunn Domenici many years ago. And that was a consumed income tax because it got rid of all the double taxation. On the other hand, sometimes you have things that are just tax cuts that don't really affect the existing amount of double taxation. But it's not, most people, when they think about the controversies over tax reform, they think it's all about, well, class warfare discussions about what the top tax rate should be, or special interest debates about whether or not you're going to have this itemized deduction or that loophole or that tax preference. And yes, those things are part of the debate, but the tax base is really critical because right now, between the capital gains tax, the corporate income tax, the double tax on dividends, and the death tax, you can have a single dollar of income taxed as many as 4 times, but it's only because those multiple layers of tax only exist when people save and invest. If you immediately consume your after-tax income, the federal government leaves you alone. If you save and invest, something every economic theory says is critical for long-run growth, that's when all the double and triple taxation is imposed upon you. So the tax base is something that is absolutely critical for tax reform, but it doesn't get a lot of attention in terms of the public debate outside the Beltway. Another point, I would agree with what Richard said in his opening comments. Bold beats timid. I remember way back going to Alvin Rabushka introducing the flat tax in the early 80s, and then Dick Armey popularizing it along with Steve Forbes in the 1990s. There were always various politicians coming up with incremental reforms, which they thought were very clever because, we're going to deal with this special interest group by giving them a carve-out. We're not going to be quite so bold. We're going to have 2 rates or 3 rates instead of 1 rate. Nobody remembers those tax reform plans. They never got any traction. I think that a big, bold tax reform, something like a flat tax where you sweep everything away, has more appeal to people. And in part, and this is another point that deserves separate treatment, people like a bold plan because they assume that the current system is riddled with corruption. When the flat tax first became a big issue in the 1990s, I would go out and I'd give my speeches about marginal tax rates and capital formation and double taxation, and I would see the audience beginning to nod away. But then when I started talking about all the loopholes and corruption and special interests favor-seeking in Washington, they got all excited. They saw the flat tax as a proxy for reducing or eliminating political corruption in Washington. And I think when you go bold, it gives you that extra weapon in your arsenal to argue that you're going to get rid of all the Gucci Gulch lobbyists that Jeff Birnbaum wrote about. And the corruption, I think, does matter. If you look at the amount of lobbyists in town, you chart that against the number of pages in the tax code. And yes, that's a kind of silly correlation, but I do think underneath it, there is some rationale that the more complex the tax code is, when you have 75,000 pages or so of tax code and regulations, that is a sandbox. It's a playground for the special interest groups, and that's one of the reasons why really bold tax reform has more support than modest tax reform. I also think an argument that we don't use enough is competitiveness. 30 or 40 years ago, when nations were sort of islands with very little cross-border economic activity, you could probably afford to get away with bad tax policy. But now that there's been globalization and there's a gigantic increase in the amount of especially cross-border investment, but even cross-border labor flows, I think competitiveness matters a lot. And of all the debates that I've done with my friends on the left, sometimes we'll clash on class warfare, and we all know each other's arguments, and I feel like we fight to a draw on a lot of these issues. But on the issue of competitiveness in a global economy, I don't think they have a good answer, and they've never had a good answer. When it's so easy for jobs and investment to cross national borders, it's insane to have a tax system that's so punitive. And this, of course, shows up very much in the issue about corporate taxation and the whole inversion issue. When we have the highest corporate tax rate in the world, of course companies don't want to be domiciled here. And even if you ban inversions, that doesn't stop the economic growth from occurring outside America's borders because we're fundamentally uncompetitive. But by the way, this brings me back to my first point about the tax base. Because sometimes politicians say, okay, we'll lower the corporate tax rate, but we'll make depreciation schedules more punitive, or we'll expand our onerous system of worldwide taxation. And so your rate might go down, but your corporate tax system at the end of the day would actually be worse than it is right now if you don't get the tax base issue right. But now, speaking of competitiveness, something that's a hobby horse of mine is I'm very concerned about some of these international efforts by the OECD and others to try to harmonize taxation in a particularly punitive way. The whole OECD anti-tax competition initiative is premised on the notion that there should be double taxation of income that is saved and invested, and there should be worldwide taxation. And so they're in effect trying to rewrite and put in place a system of harmonized tax rules for the world that would in effect undermine pro-growth tax reform, which is one of the reasons why I think one of the biggest budget cuts we should have, it's actually not a big budget cut, but one of the most important budget cuts we should have is zero out U.S. subsidies for the OECD because of their work in favor of very bad tax policy. In terms of tax reform, I want to also make the point that good tax reform is probably the best thing we can do in terms of reforming the healthcare system. Why? Because the biggest loophole in the tax code is the exclusion for our fringe benefits. You bring fringe benefits into the tax code, and I think insurance, instead of being sort of these gold-plated, all-you-can-eat Cadillac plans, will begin to have a system instead where insurance is for things like unexpected catastrophic costs, which, of course, is exactly the way it works for home insurance and auto insurance. We have a huge problem with third-party payer in the American healthcare system. Some of it's Medicare, some of it's Medicaid, and yes, Obamacare makes it worse, but we really need to fix the tax code if we want to fix the healthcare system. I want to echo what's already been said about fixing the Joint Committee on Taxation. I mentioned before, sometimes I have debates with my left-wing friends. One of the common debates is, what's the revenue maximizing point on the Laffer curve? You get the Paul Krugman types who say it's up around 70% or 80%. Richard mentioned that according to Merle's, it's around 20%. But you know what? There's one group that's way out of whack with even Paul Krugman, and that's the Joint Committee on Taxation, because they assume the revenue maximizing rate is 100%. I remember my former boss, Bob Packwood, sent a letter to Joint Tax, I think it was back in 1989. He asked, give me the revenue estimates for a 100% tax rate on income over $200,000 a year. And they basically came back and said it's like $200 billion the first year, then $230, $260. And so Packwood writes back, and I'm being colloquial because, of course, he worded it in a much more mature fashion than I would have. But the way I would have worded it, and he basically asked the same question, is, are you guys smoking crack? Do you really think that people will continue to work and earn income and report income at a 100% tax rate? And so the Joint Committee on Taxation eventually, this is back before computers, so they sent back a letter, and you go down, you look at their revenue estimate after Packwood asked them to reconsider it, and they had the exact same numbers, but this time they had an asterisk. You follow the asterisk to the bottom of the page, and it said, our model assumes that tax policy has no impact on employment, income, GDP, et cetera, et cetera. And they still think that that's still the way they operate. Yeah, and maybe they've tinkered a little bit, but fundamentally, their models assume that there's only two variables, tax rates and tax revenue. In reality, there's a third very important variable, and that's taxable income. And what was said before about rich people that Richard was talking about in terms of Merle's looking at different revenue maximizing tax rates for different groups, the rich are different than you and me, or at least they're different than me. If you're rich, you can buy me dinner tonight. But one thing we know about the rich is they have tremendous control over the timing, level, and composition of their income. A rich person can go on their computer and just like that shift all their investments into tax-free municipal bonds. So the tax rate can go up to 90%, and all of a sudden revenue from the rich will go to zero because they'll figure out ways that are very simple and very legal not to pay any tax whatsoever. And then my final point is that growth trumps fairness. If you're in an environment where tax rates are going up, guess what? the class warfare crowd is going to win, because if tax rates are going up, if the politicians are talking about increasing the fiscal burden on Americans, the average person is going to say, don't tax me, tax someone else, tax the rich guy. And so that's an environment where the left is always going to win. On the other hand, if you have an environment where you're saying we're going to try to figure out some sort of new tax system that's going to increase economic growth so we get more jobs, more opportunity, more prosperity, more competitiveness, I think that wins. The left tried to use class warfare against Reagan in the 80s, and Reagan beat them. Because the average person instinctively agreed that you don't want to have high marginal tax rates. Nobody should pay, as I think Richard or David said, more than 20 or 30% of their income. But the key thing I think about the Reagan tax cuts that allowed him to succeed, whereas when you have tax increase environments like under the first President Bush, is that growth matters to people, especially in a competitive global economy. So what's the lesson of that for tax reform? It probably means that at the very least you need dynamic scoring so you can have a static tax cut in terms of your legislation, but you probably even want a tax cut even on a dynamic basis. And that, of course, brings you to the real fundamental challenge to tax reform. So long as government keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger, our chances of good tax policy get smaller and smaller and smaller. Thank you.